Hello, and welcome to your next module on religion and schools. In this module, we will take a closer look at thinking about the relationships that exist between components of identity connected to individuals' religious identities and the ways in which they engage with aspects of the religious identities in schools. We'll look specifically at examples from educators in their perspectives around different religious settings that oftentimes shape the experiences and the frameworks of certain aspects of schooling, depending on where you are. And we'll also talk about the importance of understanding the regional dynamics connected to aspects of religious identity that again oftentimes play into how we even see curricular offerings and different types of supports for students across a U.S. context of schooling experience. We'll look at the religious landscape that currently makes up the experiences within the U.S. and what that means for how students connect to those aspects of identity. And we'll think about this notion of the separation of church and state. So oftentimes we hear the language and the sentiment connected to the concept of the separation of church and state, but we don't really know or have connected it to the realities of what it might mean and how it could impact the experiences that happen within U.S. schools. So that will be the framework and the guide for how we will spend our time in this module. So why is it important to think about religion in schools? Well, as you've attended to other aspects of identity throughout this course, religion is oftentimes one of the most salient components of identity that individuals bring into the schooling space. In the U.S., we know that there are about 84% of the population that identify themselves of having some form of preference for a particular religious group or aspects of religious identity, with about 42% of those individuals attending some form of church or synagogue or gathering in an average week. So that shows us where this aspect of identity plays a tremendous role in how people seek to identify themselves. We have seen some differences in religious identity in the form of data points in regards to how people have worked to identify and work towards their connection to thinking about religious identity. We know that historically, there has definitely always been a higher percentage of individuals that align themselves with the more dominant religious identities that you see in the U.S. context. So we know in the late 90s, there was at about 67% that of individuals that identify with a particular religious identity, but also attributed that connection to their religion as the solution for solving problems in the world. And that's kind of went down. And even if you take this number to bring it to present day, we also see fairly stable, but a few points lost in individuals that are lean heavily in thinking about religion as the solution to navigating problems that impact society. We know that the U.S. does rank kind of middle of the bottom half if we went for a global perspective of nations that are surveyed in connection to religious identity that ascribe to claims of religious beliefs being extremely important to them. So globally, there's definitely a difference for where the U.S. fares on the importance of religion. But we do see components of religion being extremely salient as we attend to where we see these data points as they translate into school spaces. So what does that look like if we wanted to look a little bit closer? These data points are pulled from 2016, 2017, as we were able to explore some of the survey data on the previous slide. We can see more consistent data, more relevant data for the current context that we're currently in. That gives us just insights into how we can make sense of religious identification, particularly in the U.S. context, and where we see individuals most closely aligning with when it comes to certain denominations of religious identity. So as you can see, from 2016 to 2017, pretty consistently, we see that that Christianity tends to dominate with the top three um, religious identifiers. The top half of the religious identifiers that we see listed here, and then we see that distribution changing dramatically in representation as we move further down the list. One of the things that's really cool about this visual is the idea of religiosity. And religiosity is connected to the demonstration of religion, right? So how people show up and practice aspects of the religion differently from identifying with a particular religion, right? So when we look at the percentages in the first table, we're able to see how individuals might identify with particular components of religious identity. And then there are aspects of how individuals might enact or act on aspects of that. And that terminology is labeled religiosity. So whether you see yourself as someone that's highly religious, moderately religious, or not religious at all, right? So you can be not religious, but still have aspects of a religious identity that you align with. And I think that with this visual, we can see representations for how individuals make sense of their religious identity for what it means for them as they move in and out of different spaces. We know that with this demographic from this gathering of data from Gallup, that when it comes to thinking about religiosity, that Mormons have always been by far the most religious of the major religious groups in the United States in a U.S. context, with about 74% of their identity suggesting that they are considered to be highly religious. We know that when we see aspects of Protestant, Muslim, Catholics, there's more of a mix of the ways in which people feel that they show up and enact aspects of their religious identities. And those that identify with the Jewish culture, also suggesting that there are aspects of, that's an important aspect of the religious identity, but not something that they see in the context of being extremely highly religious in how they show up and engage in different spaces. Very important to not only acknowledge the percentages of how we see these religions show up, but also the ways in which the different ways that they can show up, right? Based on this spectrum of understanding those that embody a more highly religious embodiment of their religion versus those that feel that they have an importance and a connection to their religion, their religious identity, but it's not so much so that they feel that they would deem themselves as highly religious as they move in and out of spaces. So how does religion translate into culture? Well, we know, as you all have learned in this class, about other aspects of identity, and as I suggested at the beginning portion of this presentation, that oftentimes individuals don't attribute aspects of religion as a component of identity that has strong implications on student perceptions and behaviors. But what we know, even as we attend to how individuals identify, as we look at this US data in regards to how people define themselves, religion has a very prominent role for how individuals and students experience their realities, both in and outside of school. Oftentimes, if we think about how schools are orchestrated or framed, in great part, they're oftentimes connected to aspects of geographic location, attending to some of the religious identities that might make up a certain population or a certain region of a country or a town or community. And those decisions that are made as to what's in the curriculum or what's not, or how a student is able to engage with a particular thing, could very well be tied to aspects of religion. And so this relationship that exists between religion and culture is extremely important. So how do we think about this in the context of thinking about the religious composition of schools? As I suggested, many communities in the US, as well as in states of Canada, have extremely religiously diverse populations, and that are said and proven to be strongly influential in how the culture frames itself within those respective schools. So for example, we know that a rural high school in the South could probably be majority comprised of primarily conservative Protestant backgrounds. Those are Southern Baptist, Church of Christ, denominations. And so thinking about those backgrounds, we might see that translate into what is in the curriculum, what's it seen as acceptable or not, as to what is explored in the classroom, what's seen as acceptable or not in the textbooks that are used, what's scrutinized for objectionable behaviors, tongue tied there, subject matters. So we can think about sex education. I oftentimes have students reflect back on what sex education looked like when you were in school and how you're attending to aspects of sex education now. And oftentimes what's at the forefront for some of the scrutiny and the challenge and the tensions around what that looks like in different spaces. There's oftentimes subject matter tensions around evolution, the notion of evolution, and also sexuality. Those are the three most dominant areas that oftentimes are tied to thinking about religious composition, and then how that directly translates into how we see some aspects of schooling experience. There's also another one that also comes into play when we think about history and narratives and lived experiences around who we learn about and in what ways we learn about different identities. That's also tied to who's at the helm of dictating how we see things come across in curriculum and textbooks. We know that if we wanted to look more concretely at specific regions of the US, we have different religious identities that are more densely populated in certain parts of the country. And so Ohio, Indiana, Pennsylvania, Iowa, parts of Canada, you're going to see large populations of Amish or Mennonite families. And those families do have strong influence over the culture of the schools in those regions, and what oftentimes might play itself out in curricular offerings and textbooks, etc. So there's a very strong correlation and connection there for us to understand as we attend to why it's important to think about the religious composition of schools. If we looked at Utah or Idaho, we know that there's a lot of students in that region of the country where there are large populations of members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or also known as LDS or Mormons, right? That has implications for how the schools show up and how we see and hear and learn of schooling experiences in those regions. In other U.S. communities, you might have a wide range of variety when it comes to religious identity, right? In maybe more urban areas, more highly densely populated areas with many representations of identity. So you might have students that are Roman Catholic or Baptist or Jewish or Muslim, Hindu or Buddhist, or even atheist or agnostic, all in the same space, right? And so the schools might seek to acknowledge what that means, because the individuals that are made up of these communities become the leadership that guide how we see things take place in the supports of those schools. So it's very important to think about, again, the complex nature of region and locale when it comes to what that means for how the school functions, particularly as we also attend to this new module and learning around religious identity. If we want to think historically about how we've seen religion show up in schools, we know that historically there is a legacy of white Protestant religious identity that has often influenced and been the most dominant understood religious identity in schooling spaces across the U.S., within the U.S. context. So traditionally, most public school spaces are celebrating Christian holidays. You'll see that representation across most public schools. We'll also see aspects of the Protestant religious identity oftentimes being the underscore for moral teachings that's integrated and interwoven into how students experience and are best understood in schools. We need to know that this is something that oftentimes is so very much ingrained in how schools have been structured historically, that we might also not be knowledgeable at how pervasive sometimes these teachings or these experiences might be for students that don't align with the dominant religious identity in their schooling realities. So although religion cannot be and should not be according to law, taught in public schools in such a way that it seeks to indoctrinate students into a particular religious identity, there are still aspects of religion that underscore how schools even function on the day-to-day. And we'll talk more about some of the tensions around how religion can or is not supposed to show up in public school spaces. That takes us to the First Amendment and this conversation around the concept of the separation between church and state. We know oftentimes, again, that we hear this statement, the separation between church and state, and oftentimes many students are not as familiar with what it means. And so when we talk about the First Amendment, we're talking about the amendment that states that Congress is prohibited from making laws establishing a religion or prohibiting religious worship. This has consistently been interpreted as affirming the principle of the separation between church and state. So oftentimes we see the First Amendment as directly in relationship with this notion of the separation between church and state. We see some of the first tensions when we think about case law around how we attend to the First Amendment and the separation between church and state in the 1960s, when we see one of the landmark Supreme Court cases connected to religious identity in schools or religion in schools in 1962 that talked about or that underscored the removal of prayer in schools. There were often at the time many parent groups that wanted to restore prayer in schools, but within the case of Engel and Vitale, we learned about the tensions that existed for students that felt that they didn't identify with the dominant religious identity in the schooling space and thus didn't want to feel forced to have to pray in a public school space with taxpayer dollars, right? And so that's really the premise for the argument that comes out of the 1962 Engel and Vitale Supreme Court decision that removed prayer from schools. And still, even until to this day, we still see a fight to restore that prayer in schools. And we also see aspects of that connected to thinking about some of the issues and the problems that persist in our society and the connection between what prayer could mean for moving students towards moral understandings for thinking about the solutions. So lots of different perspectives and insights about that. Oftentimes, when we think about case law and religion in schools, there's oftentimes a huge objection to this idea of secular humanism that is seen to be in the curriculum. And that is the idea that there is a huge attention to centering human beings and de-emphasizing the role of a spiritual context or a God that is in control of how the world exists and persists over time. And so there is a spectrum really of insight and understanding that really grounds the tensions that exist for where people feel like they fall on this spectrum. We know that there has been a huge kind of community resistance. If we look at starting back to this court case in 62 up until now, particularly in high densely populated areas that have very strong representations of religious identities, particularly those that are connected to dominant forms of religious identity, where there is a resistance to cultural pluralism, right? This idea that multiple cultures can exist in a space and everybody can contribute to that same space. And oftentimes this sense of community resistance is connected to conservative religious groups. And so historically we've seen much of the narrative being underscored by the resistance tied to the resistance to cultural pluralism being connected to individuals that are or would define themselves as being connected to conservative religious groups. So how do we think about that and how do we see representations of that as we continue to understand the case law associated with the relationship between schools and religion? We see that initial court case in 1962 that removed school prayer, particularly moving towards something that was non-denominational as unconstitutional. I oftentimes go through these court cases with students, and you see variations of how these court cases show up. So I read through them, and even as you're reading through them, you might even realize like, well, we didn't follow that, right? You're thinking back on your own schooling experiences, and you're like, no, we prayed at my school, or we had this kind of experience at my school. And the important thing to note is really also tied to other aspects of identity and case law that we've talked about. There could be case law or amendments and principles that have been put in place by Supreme Court rulings. But the ways in which those principles are enacted, depending on where you are geographically, could have very different implications, right? So even though there might be things in place or things that are supposed to be followed, they could show up in very different ways. And so that's also important to note as we move forward and understand some of these Supreme Court rulings. We have Abington School District versus Shemp in '63. That was suggested that Bible reading over the school intercom was unconstitutional. We also have in 1963 that children were not to be forced to participate in Bible reading. So that kind of accompanied the removal of school prayer. So the Engel and Vitale really catapulted other families, because there are oftentimes school districts and families that are bringing these to the forefront. That's how we get these Supreme Court rulings that felt that they wanted to also acknowledge some of the other tensions that they felt that they were navigating as families in the different public schools that they were from. We know Epperson in Arkansas in '68 banned the teaching of evolution as unconstitutional. You see several cases centered around thinking about aspects of evolution and how that shows up over time. You will actually be watching a short PBS special that talks about prayer and prayer in schools, and it's a more present understanding of what that means. And so think about some of the things that we hear in that video as you reflect back on some of these court cases. But all of these court cases connected to aspects of thinking about religious expression in schooling spaces and what was deemed to be constitutional or not. So what does all of this mean? What does it mean that we now know that religion and culture are extremely related, that religious identity shows up in school spaces, and that there are oftentimes dominant religious identities depending on geographic locale that have implications for how students experience their schools? Well, as I suggested on the previous slide, all of these things can show up and mean very different things. So it's very important for those of you that are interested in continuing to stay partnered with educational spaces to allow yourself the opportunity to understand the complexity of the space that you are in. Assess your community. Oftentimes when I have students that are not currently employed with a schooling system and they're interviewing or they're looking at opportunities, that the same amount of energy that we oftentimes give to other things, we need to give to understanding the community context of the schools that we might end up working or serving, or even having our children in, right? Inclusive of thinking about the religious composition and makeup of a respective community, because that could very well have implications for how certain experiences are shaped in and outside of the school space. It's also important to note the relationship that exists between some of these aspects of Supreme Court rulings, and then how we can make sense of what that means for how religion plays itself out in schooling implications. And so this slide really hits on some of the highlights for what is suggested to be at the forefront of how educators or key stakeholders in education should be thinking about implications of the relationships between religion and schools. Again, this might show up very differently depending on where you are, but these are some of the most consistent ways when we look nationally around what is the expectation around the relationship between religion and schools in public school spaces. We know that a school may sponsor the study of religion, but is not supposed to sponsor the practice of a respective religion. That's in order to make space for the religious diversity that might also be in the school. The school is able to expose students to all religious views, but not necessarily impose that particular view. The school is able to approach religion as one of instruction, but not of indoctrination. The function of the school is to educate about all religions and not to necessarily suggest that a student must convert to any one religion. The school should study what people believe, not necessarily telling students what they should believe. And as you can see, the consistency across all of these is that the exploration of religious identity, the support of students showing up into spaces with their religious identity, the awareness of students, teachers, and key stakeholders around religious identity, all of those extremely important things. But what's at the forefront of implications for schools is that at no point should a student feel that they should be not accepted or pushed to have to conform to any one belief based off of existing in that respective schooling space. This has oftentimes been the way that we've seen religion in schools play itself out. And so when we attend to the case law that we've talked about on the previous slide, it's really a pushback to thinking about the ways in which we can center oftentimes those minoritized religious identities that are also in schooling spaces. So what does that mean for how we think about the implication in the context of not the don't do's, but the things that we can think about in developing our consciousness around religious identity? Well, it's extremely important for educators to show respect for all of the religious differences that are in and outside of the school space. This happens in interactions for how we center and understand and support students when they bring their different religious backgrounds into the classroom. It's also important that we understand that oftentimes religion to students and families is extremely salient. And so developing effective teaching strategies for students that acknowledges aspects of their religious identity and supports them when they want to bring that aspect of self into the classroom can help them learn specific context and concepts within a particular space. And so if we think about the religious makeup of our schooling space, of our classrooms, or at least seek to create a more diverse understandings of multiple representations of religious identity, how might our students feel even more empowered to feel like they are included and belong in the classroom space? It's a technique that really tries to help students think about the value that is in their religious identity and what it brings into the classroom, and also encourages students to respect the religious diversity that exists within the classroom space that we often don't talk about. So as you move forward in this module, you'll have the opportunity to learn a little bit more about some examples of religion and its connection to schools. You'll have some engagement with understanding more concretely the concept of the separation between church and state. And hopefully you'll leave this module with a better understanding and critical self-reflection of how religious identity has played a role in your own life and how you can see it translating into the schooling space in efforts to be more conscious and aware of supporting students from multiple religious backgrounds. If you have any questions, as always, reach out to your instructor. Have a good one.